Good evening. And after a gap of almost 2 months, welcome to a physical meeting of the Library Subcommittee of the Bengal Club. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of the subcommittee as its chairman. And today we have our guest, who is actually not really a guest because he's one of us at the Bengal Club, but none other than a man who first decided to control the reins of a history class, then a history department, then decided to control the reins of a newspaper and ended up controlling the reins of a whole university. And he's going to be our guest today. I'm not going to introduce him, and I'm going to leave you to guess his name. But he's written this book about two ladies, a dominating and an obscure lady. And therefore, we thought to talk to him about his book, we should get two ladies today. And so two lady members of the Library Subcommittee of the Bengal Club, who know a great deal more about these two ladies and history than I do, have very kindly volunteered to talk to none other than Professor Rudrangshu Mukherjee about his book. And I'm going to start off by welcoming onto the stage the two ladies who will be moderating the session today. Can I have on stage Mitakshara, Kumari, and Chaitali Maitra, please? Maitra, as you know, is a teacher. She's been a teacher of English for over 3 decades. She's published a number of reviews. Her claim to fame is that she has published and written equally in English and in Bengali. She's published in Desh. She's published in a number of English journals. And of course, her area of research has been American history in the 19th century. Mitakshara Kumari is currently an advisor to the government of Chhattisgarh. She's entrusted with the job of transforming government schools into proper educational institutions. She's graduated from St. Stephen's College and Harvard University and has been working with the National Knowledge Commission and the National Innovation Council at a time when knowledge and innovation were more treasured by governments in this country. I thought we will have these two ladies discuss about the book, because the two ladies in the book, of course, are characters in great contrast to each other. One has been resurrected by Rudrangshu from oblivion and obscurity. The other, of course, has been recast in all her glorification and glamour. No similarity or similes to the two ladies who are currently on the dais, both of whom are very famous by their own rights. Can I now invite the main man for this evening, Professor Rudrangshu Mukherjee, to the dais? And I will ask Professor Chaitali Maitra to formally introduce him. But before we do so, I have a great pleasure and a very pleasant duty to perform. On behalf of the Library Subcommittee of the Bengal Club, I am going to release Rudrangshu Mukherjee's book, which is now, and nothing better than asking the author to hold this up for you. Professor Mukherjee, that is a book of Bengal Club Library, so it is returned. We do hope you have another one at home. I hand you over to the moderators of today's session.
Good evening, everybody. It's my privilege to be here with Professor Rudrangshu Mukherjee to discuss one of his recent books, which is also being launched today. Dr. Chatterjee launched the book just now, showed it to you, Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Rudrangshu Mukherjee. I think he doesn't need any introduction here, but still, Professor Rudrangshu Mukherjee is a well-known academic and historian whose alma mater includes universities of Oxford, JNU, and Presidency. He has been the opinions editor for The Telegraph and is presently the Chancellor of Ashoka University. He has lectured extensively in history around the world. His core research area has been late 19th century India, and he has written many books on this subject. Today, he is here with us to discuss his book, A Begum A Rani, which deals with the uncommon lives of Lakshmi Bai of Jhansi and Hazrat Mahal during the Indian Rebellion. The first plunge into the book, Professor Mukherjee, begins with your outstandingly erudite introduction, where you establish a string of truths like the unhappy and poverty-stricken 19th century India, like the importance of individuals in history writing, like the singularly important insight of remembering history, which also has the flip side of forgetting, and then gradually progressing into the thick of the aspects of rebellion and resistance. Now, in the next chapter, which you call Origins, could I please ask you, referring to that chapter and of course beyond that, to please elucidate the land revenue policies adopted by the British?
Thank you, Chaitali. And thank you, Shwandip. I must say that even though this book was originally published in the month of August 2021, it has never had a release, so an official formal release. So this is the first and only formal release, and I'm happy that it's taking place in Bengal Club, which is a kind of second home for me. So thank you, Shundi, for organizing that. To come back to the question, after the British had conquered bits and pieces of India over a very long period of time, this needs some emphasis, because all the time, including very respected historians, talk about the British conquest of India. I humbly disagree with that view. I think there were British conquests of India. They didn't conquer India in one fell, foul blow. You cannot identify one battle through which they conquered the whole of India. They conquered India, they conquered Bengal first, and not, as is often believed, through the Battle of Plassey, but they actually conquered Bengal through the Battle of Buxar. Then they conquered bits of the Carnatic, then they defeated Tipu Sultan, defeated the Marathas in the Karnataka and in Maharashtra, then Punjab, and so on. So this took well over 80 to 90 years. And once they conquered a territory, one of the first things that it did was to decide how they were going to collect the land revenue. This is the importance of what you call the land revenue system, because that was their source of wealth, and they were in India to make money. So again, there wasn't one land revenue system. Every different part of India had different land revenue systems. The best known of it is the one in Bengal called the Permanent Settlement of Bengal, which is, one historian magnificently described it as the Magna Carta of British rule in India, the first land revenue settlement. And then, of course, you had other settlements which differed radically from the permanent settlement. You had the Rayatwari system in the Madras Presidency, the Rayatwari system in the Bombay Presidency, and then you had something called the Mahalwari system in North India and parts of Central India. Now, the two areas that I discuss in this book are both parts of the Mahalwari land revenue settlement. The Mahalwari land revenue settlement decided, or the makers of the Mahalwari land revenue settlement decided that they would settle, as had been done in the Madras presidency and in the Bombay presidency, they would settle the land revenue, both the collection of land revenue as well as who would pay the land revenue. The agency as well as the collection of land revenue would be done directly by the actual cultivators of the soil, the proprietors of the soil. That's why it's called the Rayat-Wari system. The Rayat is the cultivator. So that's the basis on which they proceeded. In other words, learning from the Bengal experience, they wanted to do away with intermediaries like zamindars, talukdars, etc. That's one part of the land revenue settlement in the non-permanent settlement areas. The other was that they did away with the intermediaries, and they said that the revenue, the amount of revenue to be collected would be based on what they called the net produce. The term net produce was a direct borrowing from the writing of the political economist Ricardo, who published his book Elements of Political Economy in 1821. This had the Ricardian theory of rent and had a great influence on land revenue policy in India. This is not an original point I'm making. This was first pointed out by an outstanding scholar called Eric Stokes, who through my good fortune and blessings actually examined my DPhil dissertation. He was based in Cambridge. So this is one part of it, the net produce. So they did away with wherever possible, they did away with all the intermediaries. And in the case of Awadh, which is from where Hazrat Mahal comes from, they did away with what in Awadh and other parts of North India were known as talukdars. People who had for generations been the revenue collecting agency, and they were the lords of the rural world of Awadh and North India. They had forts, they had cannons, they had armed retainers, very powerful people. And they removed all of them as far as possible. In Awadh, 67% of the total number of talukdars actually lost their estates through the land revenue settlement, which was introduced in 1856 after the annexation. I have worked in great detail on this settlement in Awadh in my first book, which is called Awadh in Revolt, 1857-58, A Study of Popular Resistance. And Jhansi also was a part of this Mahalwari system. I forgot to explain why the term Mahalwari. When the British conquered North India and parts of Central India, they discovered, much to their surprise, that there were large clusters of these territories where it was virtually impossible to locate who was the proprietor of the soil. Because villages were often held as a brotherhood, as a community of peasants. This was called the Bhaichara system. Bhaichara, you can make it out, Bhaiya, brotherhood. And so they decided that there would have to be settlements made with the Bhaichara, the village communities. And in some places, they would have to make it with the actual cultivator, where the actual cultivator could be located. So what they did was, they divided up North India by ilaka, or what is known as Mahal, what in Mughal administrative terms was called Mahal. And they settled according to Mahals. So that is why the origin of the term Mahalwari system. Okay, I was once listening to many years ago, I was once listening to a television program where the term Jungle Mahal, which many of you have read in the newspapers because it is a part of the Maoist movement, somebody was talking about the Mahal and Jungle Mahal, and he was asked by the anchor, justifiably, what is the meaning of the term Jungle Mahal? And I burst into giggles because the man said that probably at some point there must have been a palace here, Mahal. That's why it's called a Mahal. Mahal is nothing but a Mughal revenue term. A cluster of villages is called a Mahal. So that's how the term Mahalwari originated. This is in brief the outline of the land revenue systems of Bengal. I'm sorry it's so sketchy, but I don't want to take more time because I'm sure you have other more substantive questions to ask.
Thank you, Professor Mukherjee. So I want to take you to our two heroines of the book. And what struck me most, really, we've all read about the Rani of Jhansi through our history books, through the popular narrative. And the story of 1857, as you tell it, throws up a Rani of Lakshmi Bai, which is much more complex and layered than the Rani of Lakshmi Bai we've known and heard of. And what struck me most is the fact that right up until the end, she was a very reluctant rebel, going so far as to, trying to negotiate with the British on the eve of the siege of Jhansi. So can you talk to us a little bit and our audience today about how that came to be? And despite that, despite the reluctance, how she came to be in such an exalted position. Of course, the famous sort of image of Rani Lakshmi Bai, being sort of in battle and dying in battle contributed to that. But the central premise of your book is that it was much more than that. Yeah. So if you could talk to us a little bit about how that came to be and why was she then so exalted?
So, in more ways than one, Lakshmi Bai has been done a disservice by historians. Lakshmi Bai, if she was anything, she was committed to Jhansi. And like her late husband, she was also committed to the people of Jhansi, her subjects, and the welfare of her subjects. So what drove her, actually, why she didn't join the rebellion in the first flash of the rebellion, June 1857, is because she couldn't decide at that point of time whether her subjects' interests and her own interests would be best served if she turned a rebel. Okay? And there are two other factors to remember here which might have dissuaded her from becoming a rebel immediately. One was that the Sipahis of Jhansi, who rebelled on the 6th of June, 7th of June, and also some of the common people of Jhansi joined that rebellion, they broke a promise that they had made to the British officials of Jhansi who were stationed in Jhansi, that if they came out of the fort, this was the promise that was made, that if they came out of the fort, in other words, if they surrendered, then their lives would be spared. This didn't happen. As they came out of the fort, every single white man, irrespective of age and gender, were killed. So Jhansi, if you like, had the stain of blood on it. And as the queen of Jhansi, she always thought herself as the queen of Jhansi. She was conscious of this stain, and she was also conscious that she would be held responsible for this massacre that had taken place. And she would be held even more responsible if she joined the rebellion. Then people would, the British actually, would be convinced that she was implicated in the massacre, which she wasn't, by the way. She wasn't. Now it's clear, absolutely clear from the evidence that she wasn't implicated in the massacre. So that's one reason why she kept her distance from the mutineers and the rebels. And the second factor is acted in her favor is the rebels, the Sipahis, once they had mutinied and polished off, if you like, the white population of Delhi, they thought their work in Jhansi was done, and they sped away to join the rebellion in Delhi. So in that sense, from around 9th, 10th of June 1857, Jhansi is free of rebels. And Lakshmi Bai is therefore also free of rebels. And she spends this time, there is no British administration, it has collapsed, the British have gone, the rebels have gone. So she spends this time from around June, July, right up to the winter of that year in trying to organize the administration or re-establish the administration of Jhansi under her dispensation. So again, how the revenue is to be collected, what kind of law and order will be maintained, what kind of punishments will be meted out, all the daily nitty-gritty of any administrative apparatus. She tried to establish this to her best of her ability, and she did it rather well for those 6 months. That shows her great competence as an administrator. So once, in January 1858, she keeps getting news from the spies that she has in the countryside that the British counter-insurgency forces, one from Calcutta under Lord Clyde, who was originally called Sir Colin Campbell, and another from Pune, led by Hugh Rose, later to become Sir Hugh Rose, they were closing in on the North Indian theater of the rebellion. And Hugh Rose was marching towards Jhansi. When she got this information, she actually, as you know, as I point out in this book, she wrote 2 letters where she says that I have been trying to do my best to hold Jhansi against the rebels, trying to establish an administration, trying to collect revenue, etc., etc. So I am holding Jhansi in trust for you on your behalf. This is actually what she writes. But the British at that point of time are in no mood to listen to this kind of overture because they have seen their countrymen in various parts of India, in Kanpur, in Lucknow, in Fatehgarh, in Allahabad, in Benares, in Delhi, in Jhansi. They have got reports that they have been butchered by the rebels. So every Indian is suspect of being implicated. And I'm not exaggerating this. Colin Campbell's troops, led by General Havelock and Colonel Neil, marched down what is today, even then was called the Grand Trunk Road, from Allahabad towards Kanpur. And I haven't been down that road for a long time, but in the 1960s, when I drove down that road, I still remember that it was lined with beautiful trees. And I guess in 1857, it had even more trees lining that. Now, in that column that is marching up the GT Road was a journalist from the London Times. His name was William Howard Russell. You can call him the first embedded reporter because he was actually marching with the army. And Russell sent dispatches to his newspapers on a daily basis, which one can read in the London Times. But more than that, he kept a diary. So Russell's diary is now available in print in 2 volumes. And Russell actually describes, he says, that on that stretch of the road from Allahabad to Kanpur, he said there wasn't a single tree on either side which didn't have 3 to 4 males, who had been strung up without even the single gesture of a trial. You were brown, you were male, therefore you were a rebel, you needed to be strung up. This is only people who were strung up. I mean, Russell does not describe acts of bayoneting as well that took place. We know one such act from another source. A 12-year-old boy on the outskirts of Benares was actually playing with a military drum. He had picked it up on the road, somebody had left it behind. He was bayoneted by 3 British officers, 12-year-old boy. So that was the extent of the suspicion and the extent of the vengeance that informed the counter-insurgency troops. So they were in no mood to listen to the Rani of Jhansi's overtures that I am holding Jhansi in trust, etc. So they were, and this was evident to the Rani because nobody responded to those letters, that she was in deep trouble. That Hugh Rose was going to attack Jhansi, that she was the leader in Jhansi, acknowledged leader in Jhansi, that she would be the target of this vengeance. They were actually trying to take over Jhansi and arrest, imprison, kill Lakshmi Bai if possible. And it's then that she decides that, okay, now the time has come when I should declare that I am actually the leader of the people of Jhansi. The people of Jhansi have turned rebellious, turned anti-British, and I am with them. So that's how events unfold. So I am saying she has been done a disservice because these layers that she evolved as she met circumstances, the reality of that summer and that winter. It was not a matter of black and white. She went through a process and actually exercised choice. I want to emphasize that a woman in the middle of the 1850s is actually exercising choices and making very difficult and complicated decisions. Okay? I think this is extraordinary about her. Right? And then finally, of course, she joins the rebellion. She escapes from the fort when Hugh Rose's troops enter Jhansi with her baby boy on her back and on horseback. She was an outstanding equestrian. She jumped through a wall, a gap in the fort, and she rode out in the middle of the night. And then, of course, she was involved in a series of battles against Hugh Rose's army, and she died just outside Gwalior in a place called Badli Ki Sarai. And it's ironic, I find it very ironic and very touching that, and the horse of course was not absolutely certain whether he would be able to make that jump with his mount. So it stalled, and it's when it stalled that a sniper got Lakshmi Bai.
Well, we didn't read that here, but it's a very interesting detail.
I just thought of adding a footnote to this wonderful conversation, especially to Mitakshara's question. In the book, I had read that there was a point, Professor Mukherjee points out, that Lakshmi Bai expressed a desire to retire and spend her life in Varanasi. And this was, I think, page 25, Professor Mukherjee. And then later in the book, you describe how, as you say, that she had been swept into the rebellion. She is seen escaping in a grey, the grey color is mentioned, and an unfinished breakfast is seen in the tent.
Yeah.
So that shows her selflessness, and that shows how human motives can sort of be established in a book of this stage.
No, also very important is she has a very strong Benares connection. What is her actual name? Her actual name is not Lakshmi Bai. Her actual name is Manikarnika, because she was born in Varanasi Her father was a minor official in the Peshwa's office, and Maratha, Peshwa is of course a Maratha. And she was named Manikarnika. She grew up in Benares, and we don't know exactly, but the chances are she learned how to ride a horse, learned how to use a gun, learned how to use a sword, also in Benares. So there is this Benares pull to Manikarnika, if you like. And that's why maybe she suggested, when she found that none of the demands she was putting forward to the British administration after Jhansi has been annexed in 1853, none of her requests, pleas, demands are being even listened to. Forget about being considered. They're not even being listened to. That she expressed this desire that maybe I should retire to Benares, go back to where I came from. But she ultimately decides, and that only strengthens my point that she was committed to Jhansi. She decided not to leave Jhansi. She stayed on in Jhansi and faced the hardships. I mean, she could have gone and as a widow back to Benares, and then of course I wouldn't have been able to write this book. So it was again a choice that she exercised, that I will not go back to Benares, but I will live in Jhansi, face the hardships if necessary, if circumstances so dictate, I will fight the British. Not only did she fight the British, this is another point that should be brought out at this stage, that there were other royal houses, principalities. Jhansi was a very small principality, but there were equally small principalities around Jhansi, Orcha being the most important. They all had male rulers, all of them, let me emphasize. All these small rajadams had male rulers, and they all had their beady eyes on Jhansi. And at one point in 1857, October, I think, 3 of them get together to attack Jhansi. So the Rani's first foray as a military commander is not against the British, but she is actually fighting the rulers of Datia, fighting the rulers of Orcha, and so on. So she has to first fight them off because she wants to maintain her hold over her Jhansi.
This could go on and on indeed. My query to you, Professor Mukherjee, would be about Hazrat Mahal now. I have, after reading the book, I tried to do a tiny reading on who the Maulavis are, what they do, and a bit on them. And if you could please throw some light on Hazrat Mahal's interaction with the Maulavis. And I have typed the question: did this contribute to the teamwork of organized thinking as hostility towards the British?
Before I come to that question, I must preface my answer, and especially for this audience, many of whom may not have read this book, and many of whom may not read this book. Who is Hazrat Mahal? Okay. She's the daughter of an Ethiopian slave of Wajid Ali Shah. We have no description of her, and of course no picture of her. She must have been a beautiful and an attractive woman. And because of this, her father put her to train as a dancer and a courtesan in a very famous dancing school in Lucknow called Pari Mahal. And this Parikhana or Pari Mahal, and this is where she caught the eye and the fancy of Wajid Ali Shah. And Wajid Ali Shah made her one of his mutah wives. Now, those of you who have seen Satyajit Ray's Satranj Ke Khiladi will remember that Utram asks his assistant Western, what is this Mota vibes? What does it mean? This Pakka Englishman is completely puzzled by this term, Mota vibes. He's never encountered it before. And Western explains to him, Mota wives are wives for pleasure, and they are temporary. Okay? So Utram, of course, is absolutely appalled that such morals exist among human beings. So Wajid Ali Shah makes the lady who is to become Hazrat Mahal later, I'll just come to that, how she becomes Hazrat Mahal, a Muta wife. And because she's a wife of pleasure, she becomes pregnant by Wajid Ali Shah and gives birth to a son. Wajid Ali Shah then makes her a Begum, his Begum, and gives her this very elevated title, Begum Hazrat Mahal. Okay? Then, of course, this is 1849, thereabouts. Then Wajid Ali Shah's mother, who was a very domineering personality, again, if you recall Satranj Ke Khiladi, she makes an appearance behind a parda. Very powerful and influential on Wajid Ali Shah. So she doesn't like this idea that a slave girl should be a Begum. So she exercises her influence to force or make Wajid Ali Shah give talak to Begum Hazrat Mahal. So now here's this girl, once a Begum, who has a son and has now discarded. She has no access to the harem, she has no access to the palace, she has no access to any of the privileges of royalty. She's lost that. So we don't know what happens in the intervening period, say between 1850 and 1856. All that we know is that in 1856, Awadh is annexed by a fiat of Lord Dalhousie. I think the date is 5th February 1856. The British troops march into Awadh, and in a few days' time it is decided that Wajid Ali Shah would be exiled to Calcutta. This is where he comes, Mitya Bruce, and builds his own mini Lucknow here, as most of you know. So Wajid Ali Shah leaves Lucknow. There are very moving descriptions of his departure from Lucknow. He had to go to Kanpur to take a boat to Allahabad on the Ganges, and then from Allahabad take a train to come to Calcutta. So it is said that when he took that journey from Lucknow to Calcutta, 10,000 of his subjects followed him, singing his songs, particularly that song, Jab Chhod Chale Lucknow Nagari. So that was a kind of loyalty and sense of belonging that Wajid Ali Shah invoked among his subjects. So Wajid Ali Shah is gone from Lucknow. Then on the evening of the 30th of May, 1857, the Sipahis of Lucknow rise in mutiny, and 1 month later, in a very decisive battle on the northern outskirts of the city of Lucknow, now it's become a part of the city of Lucknow, a village called Chinhat, the rebels actually defeat the British troops. So now the rebels are convinced that the British have been defeated. They have nowhere else to go except in the residency, and they are surrounded on all sides of the residency, and they are being cannonaded right through 24 hours. Now the rebels decide that the Firangi Raj has gone. They need an administration of their own. Bring back the Nawabi. Firangi Raj is gone, bring back the Nawabi. Who do you bring back? The legitimate Nawab is in Calcutta. You can't get him back from there. He's actually a prisoner of the British. But his son is there. Who is the son? Birjis Qadar, who is the son of Hazrat Mahal. He is 11 or 12 years old then. He is put on the throne. He is declared to be the Wali of Awadh. Wali means delegate. Who's delegate? Delegate of the Badshah in Delhi. Okay? He's not declared to be a king because he's a delegate of the Badshah. He's put on the throne. There's actually an enthroning ceremony held. And I'll just come back in a minute to that enthroning ceremony because there's an important, very moving point there. And because he is just 11 or 12 years old, his mother, Hazrat Mal, is made a kind of regent. She will run affairs on behalf of her young son, lad, if you like. Now, the incident I wanted to refer to is when he was put on the throne, that enthroning ceremony, if you like, that coronation, quote unquote, Hindu Sipahis, most of the Sipahis, I would say more than 85% of the Sipahis of the Bengal Native Army were Hindus and upper caste Hindus, most of them Brahmins. They danced around Birjis Qadar. They put Birjis Qadar on the gadi and they danced around him. And what did they sing? What did they say? They said, "You are our Kanhaiya. You are our Krishna." Now think of this. It's rather unimaginable in Modi's India, I admit to that a group of Hindu sepoys are actually singing to a Muslim prince that you are our Krishna. Okay? Now why are they doing that? I mean, this is not completely out of context because Birjis Qadar's father, Wajid Ali Shah, is to dance as Krishna. He had operas written on the life of Krishna. He himself wrote these operas. And the great-great-grandfather of Birju Maharaj, who just passed away, actually taught Wajid Ali Shah how to dance. And through that training, Wajid Ali Shah in his own operas would dance as Krishna. So therefore, his son is being praised as "You are our Kanhaiya." Now, this is how Begum Hazrat Mahal enters the pages of history. I mean, if Birjis Qadar hadn't been put on the throne, if Wajid Ali Shah hadn't been exiled, Hazrat Mal wouldn't even be a footnote in history. She would just be a discarded Begum, and nobody would have remembered her. But she takes over the reins of the administration. She establishes an administration, directs how the British are to be fought and how the British are to be removed from Awadh. So she is a typical general who is not out there in the front in the battle line, but is actually working backroom, making all the plans, strategies, etc., etc. And more than that, this is equally important, she is also issuing in her own name and in her son's name what were called ishtahars, which means proclamations. Ishtahars to rouse the morale of the army, the rebels. Ishtahars to point out the innumerable misdeeds, according to her, that the British had committed in India. The unhappiness that you referred to. And third, when in November 1858, the Queen Victoria, issues a proclamation announcing that now the East India Company would no longer be ruling India, she would be ruling India. And there's a very long proclamation, which was obviously written in English by her Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston, and then was translated into Persian, Urdu, and then announced by the town criers in the various towns of North India. A copy of that proclamation, the Queen's proclamation, reached Hazrat Mal, and she issued a counter proclamation, which is known as the Begum's Proclamation. Okay, so it is a paragraph by paragraph rebuttal of every single point that the Queen's proclamation made. Okay? In fact, the refrain is, every paragraph in the Begum's proclamation begins with, it is said in the proclamation. So first she says that this is what is said in the proclamation, and then she rebuts it, how it is wrong, illogical, non-factual, misleading. This is the other very important point right through the Begum's proclamation. She's saying this queen is trying to mislead you. Don't believe her. The Britishers cannot be believed because they are by nature deceivers, deceptors, and liars. So Begum Hazrat Mahal is also doing that. She is setting up an administration, laying out plans and strategies of battle, and she is also carrying out what we would today call acts of propaganda and persuasion.
Right. So actually my next question, Professor Mukherjee, was about this battle of ishtihars and proclamations. So while I was reading the appendix that you have with all the proclamations attached there, what struck me most is, you say that this was a war, 1857 was a war of arms, of course, but it was also a war of words, very much a war of words. And at least on one side, it sounds like a very modern political campaign. There are these ishtihars where point by point Hazrat Mahal is rebutting Victoria's proclamation. There's also fake news, rumors, because the other proclamation, which was presumably the Maulavi under Bijris
I didn't
Qadr's,
answer your point on the Maulavi. I'll come back.
We can answer that here. And so that Fateh Islam.
Fateh Islam.
That
which is
has
actually a pamphlet. It's not an ishtihar.
So that sounded like rumor, fake news,
Yeah.
Smear campaign all put together. And then there was the emperor, Bahadur Shah's proclamation, which to me was remarkable because here was the emperor. He was almost putting out a political manifesto of a party, saying that if the Badshahi government was there, the zamindars would be promised XYZ, the artisans would be promised XYZ, the soldiers, in fact, the salary of soldiers was specified. So it's a very sort of modern political campaign in some ways.
You're very right. It's also modern in another way. All these ishtihars and pamphlets were printed. Right?
Not how we
so
thought
they
wars
took
were fought.
advantage of modern technology that was available to them. So the printed, let me be a little more specific about the male gaze, since you raised the point. I'll try and find that paragraph. Okay. So we have only one description of Lakshmi Bai, what she looked like, what kind of stature she had, a physical description of Lakshmi Bai. This was written by a man called John Lang, who was probably the only Westerner who had set eyes on Lakshmi Bai. Lakshmi Bai, before she went into battle, Lakshmi Bai was under parda. Okay? The only Westerners to see Lakshmi Bai, as far as we know, was this man called John Lang. And this is what he wrote. It's worth reading through that description. She was a woman of about middle size, rather stout, but not too stout. Her face must have been very handsome when she was younger, and even now it had many charms. Though according to my idea of beauty, it was too round. The expression was also very good and very intelligent. The eyes were particularly fine and the nose very delicately shaped. She was not very fair, though she was far from black. She had no ornaments, strange to say, upon her person, except for a pair of gold earrings. Her dress was plain white muslin, so fine in texture, mark these following words, so fine in texture, and drawn about her in such a way and so tightly that the outline of her figure was plainly discernible, and a remarkably fine figure she had. Okay? So, figure is an euphemism for her bosom, as I read it. Okay? Tightly drawn around her. Okay? To make her bosom more prominent. This is what I say is the male gaze. This is a male describing a rather attractive woman who he finds attractive but not all that attractive. Okay? How does it matter whether Lakshmi Bai was attractive to Lang or anybody else? It's of no consequence to anybody except to Lang. Now, so that's what I mean by the male gaze. Now, we have no description of Hazrat Mahal, as I said before. No description at all. One reason for that is she was not seen in battle. Okay? She, as I said, she worked behind the scenes and moved around in a palanquin, not on horseback. She probably did not know how to ride a horse. She moved around in a palanquin, and she didn't meet a soldier's death as Lakshmi Bai did. She died, she fled to Nepal, and she died in obscurity, probably of cholera, in the Terai of Nepal. So that makes all the difference, I think. So Hazrat Mahal, if a British male had seen her, would also have been subjected to a male gaze. But fortunately, she wasn't. I mean, nobody spoke about her figure and her tightly drawn bodice or whatever it was. Now, these two women, whatever they might have looked like, and that is, as I said, of no consequence to me how beautiful they were or not, were extraordinary figures because they strode upon a male world, a world in which every single decision was actually taken by men of various different kinds, kings, princes, purohits, whatever you want to, talukdars, whatever you want to call them, describe them by whatever name you describe them, they are male. Okay? In such a world, they established their dominance, they established their leadership. Okay? And the trajectories are somewhat different. Lakshmi Bai, in some ways, had been trained to some practices that were considered to be male, horse riding, use of arms, etc. Hazrat Mal wasn't. She was a dancer and a courtesan, so she had no access to the arts of warfare. But yet, she got involved in a war. And she got involved in a war and took part in the war in the only way that she could, that is, using her intelligence in planning, strategizing, and so on and so forth, and propaganda and rebuttal, etc. And Lakshmi Bai also used her training in the way that she knew best, going out to fight and dying as a soldier. Always died in battle. Okay.
So my last question, Professor Mukherjee, you've outlined one of the central sort of premises of your book is that they were remembered differently, Hazrat Mahal and Rani Lakshmi Bai. One because you said that one fled while the other died in battle. The other very important aspect you bring out is the national movement as it was sort of developing needed heroes. This idea, and you open with this beautiful anecdote where there's a play by Brecht that is being enacted, and Galileo has to, Galileo is being asked to recant, and he recants. And his followers are very disappointed, and they say, unhappy is the land that does not have any heroes, and Galileo rebuts that unhappy is the land that needs heroes. And with that context, we had first Rabindranath, apparently, who wrote that essay about Rani Lakshmibai, and more generally about Rajputs as well. Then we had, I suppose, Savarkar himself, who wrote glorifying Lakshmibai. And by that time, it started taking on this, very sort of exalted, wanting bhakti. That's the word you use, deserving bhakti. And then Nehru as well, and Subhash Bose as well, they all contributed to this myth of Lakshmibai. So if that is the case, if finally history is an act of retrieval, as you mentioned, and selective retrieval, then are we, indignant today when we hear of, reinterpretations of history just because they don't match our ideological underpinnings? So what is the possibility of conveying nuance? That's my question, given that your scholarship is asking us to look at it in a nuanced way. But the consumption of history in the present moment is not nuanced at all.
So it's not just the revolt of 1857. History is also a war of words. So we have to be engaged constantly in debate. So I might disagree with some of the reconstructions that are being made of India's past, but I must also say that they have a right to reconstruct it in the way they want it. If the nationalist movement could reconstruct the past in a particular way, why not others? I have the right to reconstruct the past according to my ideological prism, so have somebody else. And we debate about these. And through these debates, the nuances come out. Okay, so you stopped at Subhash Bose and Nehru, but 2007, as recent as that, under Manmohan Singh, to a packed House of Parliament, all shades of opinion present, Shubhadra Kumari Chauhan's poem was sung by Shubha Mudgal, was put to music and sung by Shubha Mudgal. Nobody sang for Begum Hazrat Mahal. Lytton Strachey, who wrote a book called Eminent Victorian, is a very mischievous man. Mischievous writer, not a mischievous man. He was also a mischievous man, but he was also a mischievous writer. And he writes in Eminent Victorians, what is the primary requisite of a historian? Ignorance, he says.
Thank you. I will be asking you my last question, and that is more a temptation, not a question. I just want to say that in this book, which is full of such a disturbing scenario, many important names, and I feel like saying characters because I teach literature, that's all, they appear. Now you have taken up many characters with a lot of, many important men with a lot of care, and you've written a book called Mangal Pandey. You have written so many books, and now it's Begum and the Rani. So I'm tempted to ask you, who would be the other people? Would you think of Kuvar Singh, Rana Begum, Madho, or Tatia Tope as individuals contributing to specific events in this discussion?
To be honest, I would let 1857 rest for a little while. I'm in the process of writing, I can't reveal the theme, but I'm in the process of writing of other very different kinds of individuals, not connected to 1857. But for the moment, I think I have done my bit on 1857. Who knows, when senility gets me finally, I might again go back to 1857.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Mukherjee. I think the time given to us by Dr. Chatterjee is sort of more or less finished.
Well, I have to tell you, Professor Mukherjee, that when senility gets you, you don't write a book about two ladies, so you're far from being senile, and we have lots of books that will come our way from you. I have to say I'm a little surprised the two ladies didn't ask the question that I was going to ask him, which is, who is the heroine of this book, the Begum or the Rani? But I won't want you to answer this question right now. I think we'll leave it to the readers to find out. I think the villain of your book is probably history. And I think that is one of the messages that possibly you want to convey in the book. Something that we are very much aware of as we hear our different political masters today. But on this note, thank you very much for giving us your valuable time this evening, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Chaitali and Mitakshara, who have enthralled us with their questions and have actually probed very deeply, perhaps a little more deeply than you thought they would, into your book. And thank you very much for being with us, and I'd like to thank the audience for braving all the fear of COVID at a time when really COVID is on its way out, we hope, and coming here this evening to the Bengal Club. And just before I finish, it's my very pleasant duty to tell you about two events that the Library Subcommittee is hosting in the next 2 weeks. One is this Saturday, when for the first time ever the Bengal Club will be hosting a Bengal Club debate, and I hope you're all aware of it. You need to get cards which you can collect from the reception on your way out. And after the debate, there's a very special sit-down dinner for which you may also collect cards on your way out. The other very special event is a book launch on the 4th of March, which is a Friday, where at the Bengal Club, we're going to launch a book which is a translation of the biography of Usha Uthup. And Usha has spoken to me just about an hour ago and confirmed that she will be here to face questions about her biography from her two biographers and from somebody else at the Bengal Club, and has promised to sing for us for about 45 minutes to an hour after the conversation about the book. So that's the 4th of March evening, which is a Friday, and I thought I'd just inform you about these two events. Thank you very much. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Can I just take this opportunity on behalf of the Library Subcommittee of the Bengal Club, which Professor Mukherjee has been chairing for many years, to present to him a small token of gratitude on this.
Just for the sake of my bona fides, the book.
And last but not the least, it gives me great pleasure to hand over a little bouquet to the two ladies who have spared their time today.